But before I found my way into paleontology, I actually got an archaeology degree. So it's kind of fun because I also, like Marisa, kind of got interested in archaeology by visiting Ireland right after I graduated high school, before I started applying for colleges. And I loved all the sites in Ireland, and I'm really excited to hear about this site. So let's dive into it. Today, we'll be hearing from Dr. Michelle Comer, archaeologist and director of the International Caherconnell Archaeological Field School in Ireland. Michelle is joining us from her office at the University of Galway. Before we jump into our talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about the housekeeping and the Zoom webinar. You are all on mute, but feel free to let us know where you're from in the chat. So just click the chat button at the bottom of your screen and let us know. I am here in Seattle, Washington. The chat is where you can also add your questions for Michelle, and we'll do our best to field and respond to your questions after she speaks. We are recording this and it will be available later. Dr. Michelle Comer's research interests lie mainly in the archaeology of Ireland's early medieval period, approximately 5th to 12th century AD, especially its fine metalwork, economy, and settlement, and in tracing the social and economic change over broad spans of time. Michelle has over 30 years excavation and post-excavation experience. She is currently directing a project examining the settlement landscape of the Burren, County Clare, and in the first and second millennium AD, which includes the Caherconnell Fort. She is a professor of archaeology at the University of Galway and has had more than her 15 minutes of fame after having appeared in documentaries, podcasts, and made international news with the discovery of the oldest ink pen in Europe at Caherconnell. Today, Michelle will talk about her work at Caherconnell Fort and why the site is so important to our understanding of ancient life in Ireland. We'll hear more about what she's uncovered today, and best of all, let us know what the DIG participants can expect to work on next summer. So please join me in welcoming Michelle.
Thank you very much, Kelsey, and thank you, Marisa, and everyone else who has joined us today. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about our work here in this place called Caherconnell in Western Ireland. So what I would like to do is to start with some kind of just general introductory information, then give you an overview of what we have discovered so far, and then talk a little bit about where we will be working this summer and how it all fits in together. So hopefully we will have quite a coherent story by the time we are finished. So let's get started then. The first thing to note is, I suppose, the name of the project, the Caherconnell project. Caherconnell is a place in Western Ireland, but the place name actually derives from the name of the largest monument in the area. And of course, I will be talking about that monument now shortly. But before we start and get into that, just by way of introduction, a quick timeline, if you like, of the Irish past, so that you can place what you're about to see into kind of the bigger picture. So the first human activity on the island of Ireland occurs around 10,000 years ago, around 8,000 BC. And this is the era that we call the Mesolithic, or the Middle Stone Age. It lasted for about 4,000 years. And this is the era when people were nomadic in Ireland. They were hunters and gatherers. Then around about 4000 BC, we see the introduction of farming, the introduction of agriculture. And this leads to huge changes in society. People begin to settle down because they're farming the land. They start building very large ritual burial monuments, of which Newgrange is perhaps the most famous. Then another change occurs around about 2400 BC with the introduction of metalworking. Initially, the working of gold and copper, but very soon they realized the addition of tin to the copper gives you bronze, and we enter the Bronze Age proper. And this continues until around about 600 BC. It's a very interesting era because a lot changes during this time. People are still farming, but we see the emergence of elites, warrior elites in this particular case. And that continues into what follows, the Iron Age. As you might guess, this is characterized by the introduction of the new metal, iron, around about 600 BC. And it's also the era where we see Celtic influences coming in from the continent of Europe. Our next big shift occurs in the early 400s. We don't have an exact date, but this is when Christianity arrives in Ireland. And Christianity sees the start of our next period, number 5 there, the early medieval period, which lasts from the 5th century, the 400s, right through to the 12th century. It is characterized by the introduction of Christianity, and of course with Christianity comes literacy for the first time, so we have our earliest written records. It's an era often referred to as the golden age of the Irish past. And you know, it's famous for such things as the Tara brooch, the Book of Kells, and of course Viking activity in Ireland towards the end of the early medieval period. That is then followed from the 12th century onwards by medieval Ireland. We choose the 12th century because this is when the Anglo-Normans come to Ireland. From 1169 onwards, we have the Anglo-Norman invasion, if you want to call it that. And Irish archaeology and Ireland changes quite a lot from the 12th century onwards. It's an era characterized by the Anglo-Norman building of great castles across Ireland, the Anglo-Norman building of towns and villages for the first time in Ireland. And indeed, they are also responsible for building some of our great abbeys in this era. So these are the general periods of the Irish past, and as we progress with our story, you'll see where our work fits into this. So the Caherconnell project then, where exactly are we? Well, we're about midway along the western seaboard of Ireland. So you can see it here with the red arrow. So this is County Clare, and more specifically, we're in the northern part of County Clare. I'm talking to you today from Galway City, which is just around here, just across the bay. So not too far from where I'm sitting right now. When we zoom into that area then over here, the larger area is kind of a study area where my work in the Burren started really. But in terms of excavation, we have zoned in on this area here marked in the kind of orangey colour. This is the townland of Caherconnell. Townlands are the smallest territorial unit in Ireland. And in this case, it is the largest archaeological monument here that has given the name to the actual townland, telling you something of its significance. Now, the monument really, or the monument type that brought me to this particular part of Ireland is something called the ring fort. And the ring fort was the characteristic monument or settlement form of the early medieval period, so from the 5th to the 12th century. This is where the vast majority of the population lived in early medieval Ireland, these enclosed farmsteads. There were no native towns or villages, no urban settlement at all. Everyone was a farmer. Settlement was relatively dispersed. These are the most common field monuments in Ireland, at least 45,000 of them recorded, and some estimates of the original number go up to anywhere around 120,000 of them. They each housed a single family. So you have this roughly circular enclosure, inside of which you had 1 or 2 dwelling houses with maybe some workshops or outhouses around them. It's essentially an enclosed farmstead, and the enclosure was for shelter. Across most of Ireland, the enclosing element is of earth, an earthen bank with a foss or a ditch dug outside it. But along the western seaboard of Ireland, where you don't have very deep soils, but you do have lots of rock outcrop, they tended to build their ring forts of stone, of dry stone. So there's no mortar used in the building. And these we call cashels or cahers, essentially just a stone ring fort. In the Burren, and you see in this map over here, a distribution map of the ring forts in County Clare. The yellow ones are all the stone ones, and the Burren is up here, which is a very stony karst limestone landscape. So understandably, I suppose, the vast majority of the ring forts up here are the stone variety. There are maybe 500 or 600 of them in total. It's a very densely populated area with these sites in the early medieval period. The typical Burren ring fort It's about 20-25 meters in diameter, with walls about 2 meters thick and originally about 2 meters high. So relatively modest affairs, and the vast majority are also circular. So this is the monument type that I was studying, had studied for my own doctorate, and was well aware that there was great preservation of these monuments and associated monuments in the Burren region. So that's why I started my current project down in the Burren. I wanted to investigate and find out more about these monuments. As you will see, I am finding out a lot about these monuments, but a whole lot more than I bargained for on top of that. So we're now zooming in to Caherconnell townland, and Caherconnell is here in the middle of this map. It's a map where all the red dots are stone castles or ring forts. So this is what I mean by a dense population of them. There are lots of them, and there's a good reason for it, really. And that good reason is the farmland. So the greener areas on this map here are the deeper soils, the valleys, where you could grow cereals. And the rest then are uplands, which are ideal for grazing animals. So if you were a farmer in the early medieval period, and most people were, then this was a good place to be. So that's why there's lots of people here. Another good reason for being here is that you're situated along two natural routeways through the uplands, one running north-south, and this yellow line is a modern road following it, and one going east-west, and again, there's a modern road following that. So it's a place with good access to the outside world as well. Even though today lots of visitors think it's, it's quite isolated or remote, not so much in the past. So now we're going to zoom in a little bit closer. And here we have a survey of Caherconnell townland and the focus of our work here. And more specifically, these are 3 stone ring forts, or cashels or cahers, here in Caherconnell, very close to each other, only about 100 meters, from the northern one to the southern one. So a tight cluster of these 3 stone ring forts. And as you can see on the map, there's lots of other archaeological remains in the immediate vicinity as well. So our approach here was a landscape one. We want to find out as much as possible about all the elements of this landscape and how they fit together. So it's an ambitious project, but we've been working on it now for quite a few years, and it has really been, giving us some nice results. So speaking of results, I'm going to give you a very quick overview of the sites we have excavated here so far. And we're going to start with this little feature here. Okay, which is here. So here we have the 3 larger enclosures or ring forts. But first of all, before I talk about those, I'm going to talk about this little feature out here. What is it? Well, first of all, it's something called a doline. Now, a doline is just a natural sinkhole in the limestone geology, the karst limestone geology of the Burren, that the Burren is famous for. It's essentially a small hole in the landscape. It has a sunken base, so it's quite sheltered. And because of that, these dolines very often see lots of different activity in the past, and even still today in some cases. The wall you see around the top is a modern one. It's simply to keep farm animals from falling in. But this is what we saw then over here on the right, is what we saw before we excavated, some exposed stonework, or indeed the farmer who owns the land brought us out and showed us this because he was aware of it and was wondering what it was. So that's what we could see before we excavated in here. And what did we find? Well, what we found was nothing like what we expected to find, but that's really the story of this place. We found the remains of an early Bronze Age house, and you can see kind of a date range there from radiocarbon dates, about 1883 to 1750 BC. We found the post holes left behind from the timber posts that supported this wooden house, and we found lots of the stone artifacts, the lithics that went with the settlement here, including the nice arrowhead that you see there on the screen. We had no clue that was here before we excavated. It was a completely accidental discovery in some ways, because we had gone looking to investigate this stone structure. So this is it with the grass taken off. What it is essentially the remains of a stone structure like that reconstructed at the bottom there. Nice wide entrance, originally had a stone roof. We found it collapsed inside it. And this partially overlay the Bronze Age house. So that's how we found the Bronze Age house, simply by looking underneath this stone one. But this wasn't a house, this structure. It seems to have been a food store, built maybe around the 11th century and used for, at least a couple of centuries after that. We found some artifacts from those centuries that had been dropped down around and inside this structure as well. So it was a very interesting small little hole in the ground, giving us early Bronze Age settlement evidence and essentially a kind of a medieval food store. Towards the end of the early medieval period, it was built and used into kind of what we would call the medieval centuries as well. Next, we're going to move south from there, and we're going to look at the southernmost of the three stone ring forts here, or cashels. This one is unusual because it has straight walls. It's not circular. The vast majority of ring forts, both earthen and stone, as I mentioned earlier, are circular. So we have questions about this one right from the start. Why was it different? Another difference, it's actually bigger than your typical Burren ring fort at about 34 by 37 meters in dimension. And we excavated most of the interior over the course of a few summers. And we found different periods of activity inside here. But I suppose kind of the primary activity is represented here in the middle. These larger kind of corner enclosures, those are early modern. They're little animal pens that were built much later. But at the core of everything, you had these three structures. We call them A, B, and C. At least one of which had a nice central fireplace in there. So the people were living here in these structures. The rest of the space around them, if I just go back for a moment, was divided up by these little yard walls. They were just low walls. These were open roofed areas or spaces around the three structures. So lots of open space, just divided up into little compartments. The artifacts that we recovered, the finds, were typical early medieval objects. So everyday items like, as you see here, whetstones for sharpening metal objects, a stone spindle whorl used in spinning to make yarn, which was then woven to make cloth, part of a quernstone used for grinding cereals, and then miscellaneous iron tools pictured here. So parts of shears, like for shearing a sheep, and down here, lots of knives. Everyday items. But there was also a small collection of higher status objects, luxury, personal ornaments, if you want to call them that. And you see some here. These are very small fragments of a much larger object, a hair comb, but a decorated one. It's made of animal bone. These are fragments of polished stone bracelets or lignite bracelets. Over here we have a series of beads, 4 of which are made of glass. Now, glass was tricky to make and was, as a result, an expensive material, so a higher status material to have. And the same applies to these. These are made of bronze. Ignore the green color, that's just how it tarnishes now. Originally, those were a nice golden color. But once you start finding the non-ferrous metals, bronze, silver, gold, etc., again, they're slightly higher status than iron, for example. We found lots of animal bone, revealing that these people were indeed farmers. They had mostly cattle, but also some sheep and pig, and then much smaller numbers of horses, cats, dogs, and domestic fowl, hens and chickens. So they were farming and they had, quite a good diet as well. It's the artifacts and the size of the site that tell us something about the status of the people in the place. Slightly above average. Not by any means the top of the social ladder, but not your typical farmer either, because your typical farmer wouldn't have these nicer objects. In terms of date, our radiocarbon dates tell us that the site was lived in and used between the 7th and the 9th century AD, and indeed occupation here had ended by the 10th century, when there was some dumping of rubbish blocking up the entrance, etc. So the status and indeed the date are really no different than what you would find at a lot of the circular ring forts. So we're still left with the questions of why was it different? Why is it different in shape? And I think, anyways, that the reason for this is the occupants, yes, they were farmers like everyone else, but they had an additional role. And I think this additional role relates to the social structure of early medieval Ireland. Early medieval Irish society was made up of lots of different social classes. Kings at the top, then lords, then farmers, then the unfree at the bottom. But the way it worked was, we'll take, for example, one of the kings. A king had to have a certain number of social inferiors. They were called clients, and the system was called clientship. The king would give a gift of land and maybe livestock. They would provide legal and military protection for their inferiors, for their clients. And in return, the clients had to provide things such as military service, hospitality, and a regular tribute to their superior. And that tribute could be in the form of animals, foodstuffs, or maybe other kind of craft items that they made. So how does all this relate back to our site? Well, we know from the written records at the time, remember, literacy comes in this era. We know that someone like our king had, they had various employees, one of which was a steward called a rochtere in Irish. And part of his role was to collect the tributes from all of the clients. So I'm thinking that a site like ours here was an ideal dwelling for one of these stewards, because people could access the place along the routeways. They could pick it out on the landscape as being different from the circular ones and say, oh, that's the one that we want. And there's plenty of storage space inside for the gathering of animals or other items before transferring them on to wherever the superior, wherever the king lived. So I'm thinking that the people who lived here, yes, they were farming for themselves, but they had that slightly elevated status as well because of who they worked, more directly for. So a really interesting site. There aren't many of these straight-walled ones across the Burren, maybe a dozen, 2 dozen, compared to the 500 or 600 circular ones. So they're quite special places. And they might suggest that people were coming to this area for this service that they were receiving here. Okay, so now we're going to jump north to the northernmost of the three and the largest surviving of the cashels in Caherconnell townland. And it is the site called Caherconnell itself. Now, I don't have time to go into all the details about the site, but I'll give you a very kind of quick overview of the place and what we have found. And the first thing I'm going to tell you is actually it was here centuries before the castle or the fort was even built. So for a moment, try to imagine that is gone off the landscape. And the earliest evidence that we found here was this: a small burial mound dating to the late 6th, early 7th century AD, covering the remains of an older female and some children. This was just a small burial mound, 1 meter or 2 in height, several meters in diameter, that was just sitting on the top of this low hill at this time. These would have been early Christians in the area, but not yet buried at a church site. It's not until several centuries later that the actual cashel or stone ring fort itself is built in the late 900s, the late 10th century. And what's really interesting is they didn't avoid the burial mound. They didn't clear it out of the way. Instead, they deliberately built their structure over the top of it. And this is something that early medieval royalty did when they were taking control of a new territory. They made a very visual, physical statement by acquiring the ancestors of that place, of the territory. And I suppose In so doing, we're claiming that they had the ancestors' blessing to take control. So that in itself, that simple act of building their wall over the top of this burial mound tells us there's something special about this particular site. Now, there are other clues also. The size of it, it's 42 meters in diameter, twice the size of your typical Burren ring fort. The walls are 3 meters thick and originally may have been about 5 meters high. It's in this strategic location with good farmland and good access to the outside world. We then see our first occupation, obviously, in the late 10th century. We have a big house in the middle, structure 1, smaller structure to the rear of it. We have areas for ironworking. We have areas for non-ironworking, the other metals, the precious metalworking, kind of on the opposite side of the site over here. We have a rubbish tip. We have a cereal drying kiln, and we have the footprint of other structures in various places. We also have lots of objects, of artifacts. We have just under 2,000 artifacts from the site in total. And from each phase of occupation, there's a range of different things. Here in the late 10th century, we have a range of everyday objects like spindle whorls, as you can see there, or even little dress pins. There's a little iron one pictured here. But then you have the luxury items. We have bronze dress pins. This is the head of one of the little bronze dress pins here. And this is hugely detailed, but it's in a tiny object. So that animal's head is 5 millimeters from snout to ear. It's tiny. You can imagine how expensive something that detailed was to either have made or to acquire, however it was acquired. And pictured in the middle there, we have a small amber bead. Now, I show this one because not only is it very finely made, but it's quite significant because amber is not native to Ireland. It's found in the Baltic region. And in the late 10th century, Ireland's connection with the Baltic region came via the Vikings. So the people who were living here had some sort of connection with Viking trade or Vikings of some description. We don't know what the nature of the relationship was. It could have been hostile, it could have been friendly, it could have been trade. We simply don't know, but they do have access to the outside world. Then in the 11th century, the interior changes. It's redesigned. Gone is the original large structure, and it is replaced with these 2 straight-walled or rectangular ones instead. The rubbish tip moves up here, the cereal drying kiln is still in use, and we still have outdoor work areas. The artifacts continue. Everyday objects like this iron shears up here. Down here, we have a gaming piece. This is a small little piece that was used for playing games. It would have been used probably with a wooden board, game board, which had holes in it. So the little peg just fitted into that. So these people have leisure time. They're playing games. Here we have our only piece of gold from the site, but gold is the same in any culture, in any era, really. It is, top status indicator. It's purely decorative. And here, as was mentioned at the start, we have one of our most significant finds. This is an ink pen. It's a pen for dipping in ink, but it's evidence of 11th century secular literacy, which is a first for Ireland. Up till now, our only evidence of literacy actually comes from monastic, from church sites. But even then, there is no other example of an ink pen from early medieval Ireland, or indeed from medieval Ireland. We don't find them until much later. And pens of this type aren't known from anywhere in early medieval or medieval Europe. So it was a really significant find for us to prove secular literacy this early, if nothing else, is an indication of the sheer high status of this place. And then late in the 11th century, we see the start of our next phase of occupation, when a 3rd rectangular structure is added and various other features that you see drawn in there. The artifacts continue, everyday objects like quernstones for grinding your cereals, and your luxury items as well. Here in the middle, we have a very nice silver finger ring. perfectly intact, as you can see there. And at the bottom, the little bronze peg with the hole in it, that's actually a tuning peg from a harp. So now not only do we have games, but we have music as well. And this phase of activity continues through into the 14th century. Now, this is really significant because up until now, and indeed when I was at university, we were taught that ring forts went out of use in the 12th century when the Anglo-Normans came. Where the people were supposed to have gone, we were never told. It was something of a mystery. But here we have proof of at least one wealthy family continuing to live in their traditional home, regardless of what the Anglo-Normans are doing in other parts of the country. So this era is spanning those transitional centuries from early medieval into medieval. Our final occupation, human occupation of the site, dates to the 15th, 16th century. And you can see the interior changes again. Now we're reduced to just one house, a new one, albeit. So there are fewer people living inside the castle now, simply because the family have gone and built a late form of castle called a tower house, not too far from here. So they've kind of split themselves between there and here. But again, you know, the artifacts continue. We have iron nails. We have evidence then of contact with the outside world in the form of the coins that you see there. Two are of silver, but they're English, 16th century coins, minted in England. The third is bronze, and it has come in the 16th century from Nuremberg in Germany. And the little red, white, and blue glass bead you see at the bottom there also dates to the 16th century, but that was made in Venice in Italy. So now, at the end of our human occupation here, we still have contact with the outside world. From all our phases of human occupation, we have other materials. So we wouldn't class these as artifacts as such, because for us, artifacts are deliberately made objects. These are more kind of samples. We have lots of animal bone fragments, for example. They preserve perfectly. They can be broken up, but they don't decay. We have tens of thousands of them. I've just had a PhD student finish her thesis just on these animal bone fragments, mostly cattle, and then lesser numbers of sheep and pig, horses, cats, dogs, red deer, so they're hunting, fish bone, all sorts of things. Charred cereal grains, so we know they're growing and processing the likes of wheat, barley, oats, rye, peas and beans. They're eating shellfish, cockles, mussels, oysters, scallops, periwinkles. They're eating hazelnuts. We're finding the charred shells of them. And they're working in metal throughout all of these periods. We're finding the waste material, the metalworking slag. So all of this has combined together to tell us how important and how wealthy and how high status a site this was. We have some other clues as well I haven't gone into that would suggest that this was a royal site, that there was a king of some description living in here, and his name was Connell, hence Caherconnell. So we know the site is twice the size of your typical Burren castle. It's in a strategic location with access to the outside world. It's a place people have wanted to be associated with for centuries. It has high status, objects made of silver and gold and glass, and it has high status activities, leisure activities, military activities, and indeed contact with the outside world. From start to finish, from our 10th century Baltic amber right through to our 16th century coins. But the one thing you'll notice we don't have is pottery, which is really unusual once the 12th century comes along and the Anglo-Normans come to Ireland, because whilst the native Irish weren't using pottery throughout the early medieval period, or indeed the Iron Age before that, the Anglo-Normans introduced the potter's wheel to Ireland, and pottery takes off. If you were to dig any medieval town or village in Ireland, you'd be tripping over the stuff, both locally made and imported, lots of different types, but not here. And I would suggest there's two reasons for that. One is practical. If you drop a clay pot in the rocky Burren, it's going to smash, and you don't know how long you'll have to wait to get a replacement. But I would also suggest that there's more to it than that, that there's a deliberate act here, almost a political act, in that the people who are living here have contact with places that are using pottery and selling it. We can see that. We know they're wealthy enough to buy it if they want it, but they don't. They are, if you like, asserting their native tradition in a changing world. And I would suggest the pottery is just a small part of that. And it is very much a changing world. As I mentioned a few moments ago, most students in Ireland are still taught that the archaeology of medieval Ireland is about castles, towns, villages, and abbeys, and that the native population who lived in all the earlier ring forts somehow just disappear. But here at Caherconnell, we're proving otherwise in a manner that you can't disagree with. All of the evidence is black and white and couldn't be more obvious or less subtle. So it's a really important site for what it tells us about ring forts, but also about Gaelic Ireland, about Ireland at the time of the Anglo-Norman invasion and the Anglo-Norman conquest. We're now beginning to see what the native population were doing at that time. And we're seeing that here, in this case, the native population are very much concerned with their ancestors, heritage, and tradition. Now, they were from the start, even before the Anglo-Normans came, but then there was the Viking threat. That Viking threat then was replaced by the Anglo-Norman threat and later by the English. So asserting their identity was extremely important to these people. They were perhaps even actively seeking out places in the landscape that had these ancient monuments that they could connect with. Regardless of whether or not they knew what they actually were, they could make up stories about them and claim a link to the land, if you like. So Caherconnell Castle itself has been an extremely rewarding place to work, but amazing and all as it is still just one part of the larger landscape. Which brings us to this year's work and the site that we will be looking at this year, which obviously you can see here, just about located about 20-25 meters due south of Caherconnell Castle that I've just talked about, the middle of the three castles. We've started work here, as you can see in the image here, but we know a certain amount so far, but we still have a lot of questions as to where this site fits into the bigger picture. So this is the site where some of you might decide to come and join us this summer. So I'll quickly tell you what we know about it so far, but as you'll see, we have lots of questions and lots of things still to discover. Okay, so cutting A here, we excavated in 2022, and then last year we moved over here to cutting B, and we also excavated this part here called extension 3. We didn't go into extension 2, okay? So what I'm about to tell you comes from this part of the site. Our earliest evidence dates to the early Bronze Age. We have a radiocarbon date of approximately 2200 BC. And so far, our evidence is artifactual. It's objects as opposed to structures. We haven't found a house down here yet, but my co-director in the project, who is a prehistorian, Dr. Noel McCarthy, he's determined to find a prehistoric house down here. So if any of you do join us and manage to do that this summer, he'll be very, very impressed. But so far, what we're dealing with are large quantities of stone tools, stone lithics, lots of little scrapers, but also some very nice little barbed and tanged arrowheads that you can see here. The white one is flint, which is known worldwide, but the other two are made of chert, C-H-E-R-T, and chert is our local version of flint in the Burren. It's found locally, and it's what they use for most of their stone tools. Chemically, they're almost identical, the two stone types. We also, last summer, found a small collection of little pieces of decorated pot or pottery as well, also from the early Bronze Age. Coming on in time then, we have this feature, a circular feature under the cashel, the later cashel wall, okay? So cashels are mostly circular. And this one is also mostly circular, but not fully. It has this funny shape down here, this funny little kink out, almost forming an angle. And we think this was deliberately to build over the top of whatever this circular feature was. Now, we didn't find any clue inside last year, inside this excavated part, as to the function of the structure, but you have this large kind of slab revetment. We were, probably still are, thinking perhaps it's a burial, kind of like what we saw at the top cashel, another version of that. We didn't find any burial remains inside this part last year, but we're thinking if it was a full circle and the burial was in the middle, it's probably under the cashel wall. So we have to decide this year if we're going to try and remove any of that cashel wall to look underneath it. It's a big job, so these stones are very large, but it might be worth it in the end. What you don't see on this image is that out here is very overgrown, a lot of vegetation. So we're hoping to go down in the winter when the vegetation has died back a little and see if we can see anything out here that might help us make our decision. What we can say is this was here before the cashel was built, and the cashel was built in the 8th century, in the 700s. Now, the cashel wall today is nowhere near as high as it was originally. And inside, we are also only seeing very thin archaeological layers for a couple of reasons. And one of those is that the site has been exposed to weathering, etc., for many centuries. So all that we're finding in here of the early medieval structures is a very footprint of them. And oftentimes it's a case of join the dots to find the outlines of things. But last year, we think we found the outline of a roughly circular house, stone walls. The year before, we had hints of a more rectangular structure just inside the entrance here. But we do have artifacts of the early medieval period, including this very nice iron ringed pin, a clothes fastener. Beside it, an iron knife with a bone handle, an animal bone handle, a couple of bone dress pins, more fragments of bone hair combs, and up here, a very nice little bronze fitting, which is, I don't know if you can make it out there, decorated with a little interlaced early medieval design there. This phase of occupation, we think, continued up to the 10th century AD. And then what happens in the 10th century AD, people who are building the larger Caherconnell cashel next door, they come down here and they steal a lot of the stone. They recycle it for building the other cashel in the late 10th century. So they take the upper reaches of the cashel wall, reducing it to the heights that we see today. And they also take most of the stones of any stone structures or houses that were inside, because they're of a size that are portable and reusable. So that's the second reason why we only get the very footprint of any structures left inside here. So that happens in the late 10th century. And as we've seen, they start living in the big cashel next door in Caherconnell. And it gets busier in the 11th century and onwards. And sometime around the 11th century, we think there's an overflow of activity from Caherconnell cashel next door back down into this site, which at this point is just a convenient enclosure. It's not an active dwelling place anymore. So far, we haven't found any 11th century houses, but we have found an 11th century outdoor hearth or fireplace. And we're just clipping on the edge of lots of ironworking activity, ironworking evidence as well. We have medieval objects like iron shears, nice bronze dress pin, an English silver coin, and this, which is actually part, or we're pretty sure is part of another gaming piece. So the objects we're finding here are very similar to the ones in the big cashel, suggesting that there is a very close link between them. We don't know when this phase of activity ends, but at some point it does, because the site is abandoned and a lot of the stonework collapses on top of the earlier material. And then post-medieval activity, maybe 16th, 17th century, farmers are coming back here and they're building little animal pens in pink here. A little square one here, a circular one over here, and other little walls. So they're just keeping animals in here now in the 16th, 17th century. And one of the farmers, no doubt, either lost a belt or a buckle from a belt made of bronze, very nicely made one, which we found just over here last summer. And then finally, kind of early modern times, 18th to 20th century, they're still using the little animal pens, but they're adding a few more little ones in various places as well. So these are our kind of our rough phases of activity so far, but more work this summer will help to kind of define these a little bit better. And that work, if you're interested in coming along, much of our excavation work is, you know, good old-fashioned troweling, the use of a small hand trowel on your knees, you know, working your way through the soils, looking for features and artifacts, collecting the soil that you've displaced in your buckets here, recording what you're finding. We record by drawing to scale. We record by filling out pre-prepared forms and measurements. We'll be able to show you the artifacts that we'll have found earlier in the summer before you might arrive. So we'll give you a taste of all of these things. And also the buckets of soil that we trowel out, we wet sieve on site to make sure that we're not missing any small remains. And if we have days that are very wet and we can't be outside, then we'll work indoors. We have a field school on site in our on-site facilities, and we do things like we wash the animal bone that we'll have already recovered. All the fragments have to be washed before they can go to a specialist for analysis. So bringing all of this together and looking at the overall project once again, just before we finish. This project had a lot of questions at the start and still does. So we had, as you might have guessed, questions about individual sites, you know, like the square walled or the straight walled cashel. Why was it different? We have questions about how the various elements relate to one another. And we're beginning to build up that picture now that we have dates for many of them. We ask questions about the larger landscape then. Was what's happening here at Caherconnell reflective of what's happening in the wider landscape, in the wider region, or indeed across Ireland in general? In this area where we don't have Viking or Anglo-Norman settlements in the immediate area, can we trace continuity and change of the native population throughout millennia, not just centuries? And were people here in every era, and were they using every part of the landscape? Were they aware of what was there before and interacting with their ancient monuments? Now, we've been quite successful to date in addressing some of these questions, though obviously we have further to go with all of them. So, for example, we have found our early Bronze Age settlement evidence, the house, the artifacts, things that we didn't know that were there. This is the first early Bronze Age house kind of in this Burren region. We know plenty about their monuments because they built large stone monuments and you can still see them on the landscape today, but we never knew where the people were actually living, people who were eventually buried in these. We know that the early medieval period people had a great respect for their ancestors. We see all this in the archaeological evidence. We know those people had contacts with the outside world. We now have very significant evidence of early secular literacy. We know that the medieval people were essentially a continuation of what was happening before. You know, there's no great change in this place. They too have their continued contact with the outside world, but they choose the nature of that contact. They interact, they trade, they fight, but they don't necessarily copy. They only take the elements that suit them. So it is a place, this landscape, of great continuity, at least from the early Bronze Age. And there are other elements I haven't shown you that probably date from later in the Bronze Age, maybe into the Iron Age. And hopefully, you know, over the coming summers, we'll eventually get around to all of these things and start filling in those gaps. How do we do all of this work? Well, it's a mixture of traditional and modern excavation techniques. And I suppose more of our survey work is probably more modern than traditional. We do still use good old-fashioned scale drawings, but we also use drones a lot more now to survey from the air, and more kind of digital surveying equipment, which produces lots of digital data, which we then process using various pieces of software like Agisoft for 3D processing, and ArcGIS for mapping distributions, etc. If you do decide to come and join us, well, you can expect to be working on this multi-period site with definite early Bronze Age material, definite early medieval, definite medieval, and definite post-medieval, and possibly something in between the early Bronze Age and the early medieval as well, but that remains to be seen. We may have investigated the circular structure to see if it is a burial, so you may be encountering that. And then there are some other features just to show you. So this is an aerial shot from last summer. The circle marks where the circular feature is under the corner of the castle. The rectangle beneath that is the area we're planning to open up this summer, this part of the interior, just to extend all the way down along here. Hopefully maybe find more of the ironworking evidence here. And then if we have time permitting, we may open up a trench outside across this particular feature here. So this is outside of the stone castle, which is over here. And there's something going on, something being built over here as well, which we know nothing about. So it'll be very interesting to find out what that is as well. So these are our targets for summer of 2024. Incidentally, you can see we have, these large tents on site for shelter, and the visitor center is just, 2-3 minute walk away. People often ask, why is it important to volunteer for projects like these? Well, in our particular case, this is our only source of funding. Without our volunteers, without our participants who come along and pay a fee to learn what it is that we do, there would be no project. We would have all those questions and none of the answers. So your participation couldn't be more important to this particular research. And it's not just research about this specific site or even this region of Ireland. It's relevant to the entire landscape of Ireland. Why? Because in this part, we have such excellent preservation of material that we can address questions that can't be addressed in other parts of Ireland where they don't have the same levels of preservation. So what you see in kind of orange here are the sites we have excavated. In the middle, we have our target for this summer. There are other sites around that, lucky enough to continue on into future years, that we will target as well. So it's an ambitious project. It has proven very rewarding to date, and we've been at this, working here really since about 2007, but properly since 2010. So if you do decide to come and join us, well, we will offer you a huge thank you. We will be, I suppose, training you in the basics of archaeological excavation, but you will also be contributing to what is a really significant project. So I'll thank you in advance for that, but I also thank you for joining us today and for listening, and indeed for in advance for asking any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Everyone give Michelle a round of applause and a thank you in the chat. We do have about 5 minutes for some questions, and we had a lot of questions just like you do about the Caherconnell ring. So I'm going to jump right into a couple of the questions. Why is it is it unusual to find artifacts that are so well preserved at the site, and why are you finding these unique finds and not anywhere else in Ireland?
Okay, there's a couple of things there. Artifacts are really well preserved in this part of Ireland because of the underlying geology. The limestone is not acidic, it's alkaline. So anything made of, well, stone obviously, but bone in particular is well preserved. The metals are well preserved here. The only thing that wouldn't be well preserved here are the organic materials like wood, leather, hair, textiles. You'd kind of, in Ireland, you'd need wet contexts for those. But everything else, it might be broken on the rocks, but it doesn't really decay. The iron will corrode, but it's not that bad, and it can be saved by a conservator. Other parts of Ireland have acidic soils, and you wouldn't find half of these things. You wouldn't find a percentage of them. And I suppose then the second part of the question, we haven't really excavated very many ring forts in parts of Ireland that didn't have too much Anglo-Norman activity. The later Anglo-Norman activity in other parts of Ireland destroyed a lot of earlier ring forts, but that didn't happen here. So we have the opportunity here to look at an almost undisturbed landscape. So those two things really combine to give us the wealth of artifacts that we have here.
So
believe me, as a student, I worked on a lot of prehistoric sites in other parts of the country, and we could go for summers on end without finding a single artifact. So this has really been a treat for me.
This is the dig to go on if you want to find something. A couple more. So do we have any idea if the ring fort dwellers were all from the same family group? How many people can we expect to have lived at these sites? If you have any population estimates.
Well, the population estimate for the early medieval period as a whole across Ireland is probably about 1 million people.
Wow.
But yes, each of these sites had one family living inside. Even the bigger ones, still one family, possibly up to 3 generations of the one family. So you may have grandparents, parents, and children until the children get to an age where they're going off and building their own ring fort. So that's kind of the population within one of these sites. Whatever a 3-generational family might have been at the time, we don't have specifics really. But you know, a busy enough part of the landscape. As to who they were and were they related, well, we only have broad strokes from the bits of records that survive from the era. We think that the people who built the big cashel in the 10th century were from a dynasty called the Dal Cash. Now, these were an important family. They were based further south, but they were the kings of the province of Munster. Ireland was divided into 5 provinces, and this part of Ireland falls into the province of Munster. And it was the king of the province who was the most powerful person on the island of Ireland at the time. There was no one king over the entire island, but there was a king of each of the 5 provinces. So the people who lived here were subjects of the king of Munster. In the 10th century, he was having all sorts of problems with the newcomers, the Vikings. So he was tightening his grip on his territory. And the way he did it here was he sent some of his own family members, one of whom who was called Connell, into this region to become the local king. So an imposed king, if you like, but still kind of related. So he came in here in the late 10th century, built a new cashel, made it very obvious to everyone who was in charge. And then his descendants stayed here after him. And they eventually become what we know as the O'Loughlin family. His son was called Loughlin. And they're here right up until the start of the 17th century, when we have a written record of them handing over Caherconnell to some different farmers at that time. So, yeah, we've some idea who was living here.
That's amazing. All right, I think I'm going to round it off by calling on Daniel, who's got a question. Yep, you can unmute, so go ahead with your question.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for all of that. I actually have tons of questions, but just for sake of time, I'll ask one that's burning in my mind. So, I'm coming from California here, and I'm thinking about bringing some students to you. And I'm thinking about the particular issues that we face when we do archaeological work in California. We break things down into what we consider historical archaeology, which is terribly short compared to what you have going on, and then native archaeology. And that poses particular problems to us because, we like to consult with the people who are descendants of the folks who established whatever site is being investigated. I wanted to ask about that kind of problem. If you are facing anything like that with Caherconnell, you just mentioned that there is a royal line that you can trace until quite recently. But what sort of descendants are you dealing with? Do you have to deal with ethical issues around that?
We actually don't have any issues like that. Probably because we're all considered, descendants of all of these particular families, and everyone is kind of interested in finding out what was happening here, and no one has any objections to that happening. And I suppose no one can trace or prove a direct lineage to any of these particular sites. We'd need kind of ancient DNA studies, very detailed ones and very extensive ones to do that. So generally speaking, in Ireland, all archaeological monuments, archaeological artifacts belong to all of us. They belong to the state. It's enshrined in our law, in our constitution. So archaeological excavation in Ireland is controlled by the state, not by individual groups within it. So in order to excavate a site in Ireland, you have to have various licenses. So I, as an excavation director, have to have my own personal license. But then each individual site also, you have to apply for a license through a fairly lengthy kind of application process, as you might imagine, explaining why you want to excavate, how you're going to do it, how you're going to fund it, how you're going to, cover all the post-excavation and publication work, the whole process. And then if you're successful, the state will issue you a license and oversee the work, essentially, in various different ways. But other than that, once you have your standards and your processes in place, we don't really encounter the same kind of issues that you would in the US. Now, obviously, we have our own, guidelines and rules about dealing with human remains. But again, that's all overseen by, in this case, the National Museum as, the arm of the state responsible for such things. But no, we wouldn't encounter any kind of more cultural restrictions, if you want to, put it that way.
Sure. I appreciate that answer. Thank you. It's interesting to think about such a diffuse concept of connection and ownership, and then with the state having ultimate call over those sites. Thanks.
Yep, you're welcome.
All right, Mary has a very burning question, so this will be the last question that we ask you. But Mary wants to know, are there any other ring forts that show occupation during and after the Anglo came, like Caherconnell?
I think there are plenty of them out there, but with so many ring forts in Ireland, we've only excavated a tiny percentage of the overall number. And to be honest, most of those that have been excavated have been in the east of the country and in the north of the country, places that have seen or did see lots of Anglo-Norman activity and indeed kind of modern industrial activity as well. And very often that's why those places were excavated. They were excavated in advance of development. But the western parts of Ireland, where you have less development, are also the places where you had less Anglo-Norman activity, and therefore the places where you're likely to find more of these medieval ring forts, or ring forts that were built in the early medieval period but have this continuity into later times. And I think there are lots of them out there. I have identified some that even have later castles built within them, so were definitely used later, but we just haven't excavated that many of them as of yet. So yep, there are plenty of targets out there if we were to, continue this work.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Michelle.
I think we're going to sort of bring things to a close, but Michelle, I wanted to say thank you so much. And I had the good fortune of meeting Michelle in person earlier this year and going to Caherconnell. And I can say every time I talk to you, I feel excited about, what is it in the ground that is going to turn up. It just seems like there are so many different time periods to dig through, and such a great opportunity for people to really understand and to help lend to our understanding of Irish history, and also just to learn about how to be an archaeologist in Ireland and in other locations. So Thanks again. And then, of course, everyone, if this is of interest, make sure if you haven't already sort of been in touch, and we've still got places available for next summer. And if there's any other questions, please pipe up. And of course, as I said, I'm recording this. I will deliver the recording out to the whole group so that you can review and share as you wish. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.